Very happy that we have an opportunity today to welcome Professor Wolfgang Wessels from the University of Cologne, who has been studying European integration and its institutions, European communities first, then European Union, since 1970s, and has really impressive record of research, in particular related to the European Council and its functioning within the European Union political system. So since in this course we are analyzing the main institutions of the European Union, which roles they perform, how they interact with other institutions during the process of decision-making, how they manage crisis, something which has been important for at least a decade, even more recently. And I'm very happy that we have this opportunity to hear Wolfgang's views. He is extremely productive as a scholar, and I offered students to read some of your new draft texts, which you kindly shared with us. So I hope they are familiar with your recent work. Well, I propose that we start with your introductory remarks and then well, just move to Q&A session, and I hope students will use this great opportunity to ask questions, and we will proceed with the discussion. So if that's fine, Wolfgang, I suggest for you.
That's perfectly fine.
So please start.
Yeah, first of all, thank you for the invitation. As you know, I think we should really create something like an academic community in Europe. It doesn't mean just not only the EU countries. As you might know, I'm dealing quite a lot also with my colleagues in Switzerland or in Turkey. So what we should really look at, how we can exchange our insights, how we can have meaningful discussions for academic purposes in a narrower sense, but also for political purposes. So the French sometimes says we need some kind of general debate about Europe, and I think we as academics can contribute to that. We should see that we have limits in what we can propose and should do, but still, I think that's beside an academic purpose also a general political relevance. Le grand débat européen, that's what the French like to say, and I think we should contribute to that. On the subject, of course, I guess most of you would have seen Thursday last week, not this Thursday, the meeting of the European Council, or some heads of state or government who came to the meeting of the European Council after the invasion of Russia into the Ukraine. I think there was an immediate emergency meeting, and there were some sanctions agreed upon, and which were then more translated in the days afterwards and still today. And yesterday we had, for example, also the Minister of Interior who looked for how to deal with refugees and found in many ways, surprisingly, a common way to handle this issue, which is of course of a crucial issue for many persons. So the European Council, the heads of state and government, sometimes I would like to use the term national leaders, I think are crucial for this Europe and for this European Union. We see quite often in some of our textbooks that the European Council might not always dealt with this kind of relevance. I see that especially with some of the law books, who of course mention the European Council and point at the articles in the treaty, in the Lisbon Treaty, but do not really go deeper into how the European Council works and what are the effects and impact of the European Council really is. This is partly based on a certain kind of frustration, because the European Council takes decision behind closed doors. So sometimes even, I think even on Thursday night, the heads of state and governments themselves, the members of the European Council, have to give in their mobile telephone at the beginning. So they couldn't do anything to send out later on who said what. So I think it's a high degree of confidentiality, especially also in the preparation. I've tried to study and went to a couple of chancelleries on Élysée, etc., to talk with high civil servants. They all tell me that most of the summits of the European Council sessions are already debated intensively before they meet, so that at the end they only need to discuss real controversial issues. So the European Council crisis management. I come back to that at the end, but I want to open the perspectives. I think the European Council is a key institution for many aspects of what we do together in the European Union, what the institutions are doing together. Let me make a couple of keywords. One is the European Council is the constitutional architect of the European Union. This is very clearly seen that the treaties which we have are the Maastricht Treaty, Amsterdam Treaty, Lisbon Treaty, are called according to the cities where the European Council met. The lawyers would say where the heads of state and government met as intergovernmental conference. So let's say there's legally slight differences, which I think nobody cares, but in any case. So Maastricht Treaty is a Maastricht Treaty because the national leaders have agreed upon that in the city of Maastricht, etc. And you will see here, I don't know how you dealt with this classical traditional dichotomy between intergovernmental and supranational. One of the interesting facts is that the European Council certainly is very intergovernmental. Okay, they have a president of their own, full-time president, and the president of the commission is also participating as a member. So it's not just only intergovernmental, but still it's mainly intergovernmental, but many of the decisions they take have very strong supranational effects. So as constitutional architect, they have, each time they change the treaty, they have increased the powers of the European Parliament. They have increased the power of the Court of Justice, extended it to new areas. They have also increased the power of the Commission in certain ways. So perhaps it might look a little bit strange that those people who defend national interests are strengthening the European Union. My argument is, and that's not only for the constitutional architect, is that the members of the European Council, the national leaders, have a certain, what I call, problem-solving instinct. They have a problem on the table in their national capital. And they are, first of all, oriented on national issues. But they realize in many ways that they cannot solve these problems alone by national means. They need to find common solutions on the European level. So they travel to Brussels to find common solutions. So they have quite often very different interests, sometimes even contradictory interests. But still, the problem-solving instinct means, yeah, we as our national sovereign state, we cannot solve that alone. We need some kind of way to deal with that together. Of course, that's a very general statement. But I think you see that in many ways, not only on crises like the pandemic crisis or the Ukraine crisis, but also in other points. Also before the crisis, energy policy, climate policy, fight against terrorism. These all are transnational problems and where you need some kind of common shared approach and not just national approaches. So I think that's important to see that the national leaders are transforming the European Union, and that means themselves, into some kind of new way to deal with policy. So the polity, if you want to call that term, the constitution, the political system has changed considerably because the national governments representing what the German Constitutional Court has called the masters of the treaty. The masters of treaty have changed this European Union and have transformed the European Union and themselves too with that. Okay, this is, let's say, a point the European Council is the constitutional architect, treaty changing. Another important part is that the European Council is a master of enlargement. They took all major decisions for enlargement, starting with the summit in '69, long time ago, with opening the door to the British. And let's say 2 years ago, they also decided how Britain could exit the European Union. That's, let's say, an interesting story, if you want, which is a sad story for the Union in any case, and I guess also for Britain, but that's not our subject today. So the master of enlargement with the Baltic countries, if you turn to you, you know that for the accession, you had to pass the Copenhagen criteria, the political criteria of sticking to the values, the economic criteria of being competitive, and then to adapt to the whole acquis communautaire, to all the rules and goals and objectives of this European Union. It took time. It's a cumbersome procedure. We know that. But the European Council has always made the basic decisions. I said Copenhagen criteria again, because the European Council met in Copenhagen to fix these after, let's say, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the way that your country and other Central and Eastern European countries could get rid of communism, could get rid of the Soviet Union at that time. So the Copenhagen criteria was a reaction to the changed world, at least to the changed Europe, and opened the way to enlargement. I think very important. I could enumerate a couple of other meetings of the European Council. One was in 2002, which perhaps was at the end the most important, because it then fixed the date for the entry of 2004, what was called the Big Bang enlargement. It's interesting now, because we jumped that the European Council might be faced with this issue now as Ukraine and Moldova and Georgia are asking for membership. To be frank, I think that's not serious. I mean, they might be serious, I'm sorry, but I think this cannot be dealt with in a serious way. If you want, we can, of course, turn to that in the discussion. So that's deepening, constitutional architect, widening, master of enlargement. Then the European Council played a major role on what we might call economic governance. So in their treaty, in the Maastricht Treaty, they created the monetary union, which is a basic pillar of all economies in Europe. I have to add also those who are not members of the euro, of course, are related and see the impact of the euro on their currencies and markets. The European Council has been very strong in creating the internal market. That was in the 80s and 90s. The European Council is very strong linked to economy, the climate change. How should that look like? What does it mean for industries? The European Council looks each year in spring on the economic policies of member states. So they do a lot of this in terms of coordination, setting goals and guidelines, which quite often are not taken too serious. Member states don't like too much to get clear guidelines from Brussels, even if they are made by the European Council. A central point here is in the economic governance that the European Council is a master of the budget. Each 7 years, they decide about the income of the Union, own resources, how much money the European Union should get. Normally, they say 1% of the gross domestic product. They increased that in 2020. I come back to that at the end. And they created now, very important for all EU countries, this new facility, which is called Recovery and Resilience Facility, with a large amount of money to be given to member states as loans or as grants. So here we see a major part of the heads of state and government. It's always very difficult because you have the net payers against the net receivers. It's in terms of negotiation tactics, a zero-sum game. One loses and one gains. Of course, the net payers have started to get certain exceptions and they have rebates and get special funds here and there. But at the end, there's a clear cleavage between those who pay in more than they get out. The crucial issue there has left the European Union, or the crucial actor, that was the United Kingdom, who was always very tough on these issues. Whereas other net payers in smaller countries, by the way, are sometimes per capita larger payers than larger member countries. I always mention that to my German citizens who say, Germany pays the most. Yes, absolutely, yes, but not per head. I think Sweden and Luxembourg in the moment are paying per head the most into the European Union. At the end, these amounts are not very high, we must be saying. I mean, for us as normal citizens, they look enormous, but let's say for national budgets, this is not, let's say, threatening, but still for the EU, of course, a major issue. So master of the budget and of the economic governance. Then we have a very strong role of the European Council, though in a slightly different way in what you normally would call external action. That's the term the treaty has. The external action has two pillars, interesting enough. One is the what we call common foreign and security policy, where decisions are taken by unanimity. The exception is constructive abstention, which was, I think, for the first time used in the last days on common foreign and security policies concerning some issues with the Ukraine. So the European Council is supposed to set the strategic guidelines for it and to take major decisions concerning relations with other countries. This is one on the foreign and security policy side, and the other is on the commercial economic side. Trade negotiations, for example, with the United States are quite often very crucial, but as you know, the EU has trade agreements with many countries in the world, with Japan, South Korea, Turkey, etc. So here the European Council is at the top of the hierarchy, dealing both with the more political foreign policy, security issues, as with economic trade issues. Then I would like to add something which I think in terms of how member states have seen this European Union is highly important. This is called in the general terminology, the area of freedom, security, and justice. Area for freedom, security, and justice. At the first moment, this might look rather, what is that? But it's a core area of national sovereignty, home and justice affairs. Yeah? And even here, the European Union has shared competences. So they are, let's say, have a strong legal position. And in most areas, with some exceptions, the ordinary legislative procedure, that means the normal procedure, where the European Parliament and the Council, on proposal by the Commission, takes the decisions, are applied. So also in this key area, generally, if I take that a little bit together, the European Council has what you might call a state-like agenda. All areas of public policies are somewhere and somehow also on the agenda of the European Council. For that, if you want, you can read the conclusions of the European Council. They are, of course, online. It's a little bit boring, to be frank, because it's very diplomatically formulated, and quite often it's difficult to understand why certain formulations are there. So let's say I have sometimes the opportunity to talk to high civil servants and ask, why is this term there like that? And they tell me, the Italians or the Germans or whoever thought that they should use this kind of formula to make the whole more acceptable back at home. So let's say that's in Germany, for the Germans, for example, we talk about strategic autonomy, a key issue in the moment also in the European Council. And the Germans quite often like to have, in addition, the open strategic autonomy. If something like that exists at all, I don't know. But in any case, it's a typical way to get consensus. Yeah? And therefore, conclusions are not always easy to understand, but crucial. And I really recommend you to read it, even if it takes effort, I have to say that. I think state-like agenda, Then, of course, we should look, how does the European Council get there? I mean, these are 27, as I said, national leaders. National leading politicians, as you know, are normally tough persons, irrespective if these are male or female politicians, I would say. If I may say so, Mrs. Merkel, who had participated in 107 sessions of the European Council, for some looked rather nice and friendly, but she was a very tough politician, as we know in Germany, perhaps also outside Germany. So you need to be tough to be there. And then the rule for decision-making in the European Council is consensus. If you turn it around, that means each member of the European Council has a veto. And here, let me directly mention that, because I think it's important. That means also smaller member states have a veto. Because quite often I listen to people, these are the Franco-Germans, and sometimes they invite the Italians or the Spanish or perhaps the Polish. You know, this is, let's say, some kind of concert of the big countries. It's a little bit Metternich from the 19th century after the Congress of Vienna. I don't know if you dealt with that in history, in your history lessons. You know, the big countries play together and the others are of secondary importance. No, I think that's the wrong. It's really wrong. It's not only biased, but it's a wrong perception. Each member sitting around the table, it's a round table, and has a veto. And I think everybody knows that. Also the representative of larger countries know that and try to get to a consensus. So I will turn it around. For smaller countries, it's really profitable to sit at the table, to confront, let's take a country I know a little bit, Luxembourg, 500,000 inhabitants, half of the size of my city where I'm living. Cologne has 1 million inhabitants. You know, Mr. Juncker, who was for a long time Prime Minister of Luxembourg, well, he didn't care that he represents 500,000 citizens, whereas the German Chancellor represented 80 million. He didn't care for that, you know. I think small countries are sitting there. They're facing the French president and the German Chancellor, and for a long time, the British Prime Minister. And these people realize they have to work together. So I think the European Council is very helpful for smaller countries. Let me stress that very much. I think I looked, let's say one other of my favorite countries is Ireland. And I think the Irish have understood that very clearly, that they get out of the shadow of the United Kingdom to have a power, or let's say a role of their own. The Austrian Chancellor likes that very much. The Austrian Chancellor then quite often makes nasty remarks about the German Chancellor. You know, that's a way to identify Austria and to make a difference to Germany. That's a little bit, I guess, that's my interpretation, of course. But they are there. That's, you know, quite clear, and they have to get together. So for small countries, I think it's a very good opportunity to raise voice and to have an impact. I think that's an important part. So inside the European Council, there are veto players, tough politicians. And how do they really formulate consensus? And one point is you need package deals. That means package deals, especially with the budget or even more with the treaty. You need that each country gets something out. That each member of the European Council will go to the national media and said, I just come from Brussels and I achieved for my country the following points. He normally or she normally doesn't say, but I had to give in there and there. So, I mean, nothing is given. There's no free lunch there, you would say. So you have to give in somewhere. But the idea is that everybody got something out. In negotiation strategies, this is sometimes called win-wins. That's a win-win strategy, or positive sum games, etc. So, and for that, you need the president of the European Council, who plays a major role as an honest broker to bring it together, to make it a package. And and here comes in what we political scientists might have difficulties really to analyze or to identify, apparently also something like a Franco-German leadership. Not that it's a dictatorship, some sometimes claim. It's a leadership that means that everybody knows that as long as these two countries have different opinions, nothing would be achieved. Yeah? So they are looking for these people. I remember having an interview with a high Belgian civil servant who knew the European Council very well. And I said, again, the French president is in Berlin and talking to the German chancellor. Are you not, let's say, worried that they take decisions which are above your own interest? And he says, as long as they talk to each other, we are happy. And you could imagine the Belgians, of course, as you know, who suffered in both world wars, feel that especially. They have this historical feeling. It's better that they two get together. Of course, we won't drive our position in too. That's, of course, they don't give up, but they think it's very good if these two get together. And sometimes you have the impression that there's a demand for leadership. And then these countries, and sometimes Germany, supplies it to the members. But again, I think it's important, relevant, but it's very difficult to make a clear judgment about that. That's difficult because it's difficult to see how far other members of the European Council then follow what they think is given by the Germans. Listening to some people who have been members of the European Council, one indication is that they say, oh, we have a lively debate, but not everybody is necessarily concentrating. But as soon as the German chancellor starts to speak, they take notes. Yeah. So let's say there's a changing attention. One of our Swedish colleagues, Tolberg, had a Swedish prime minister some time ago, who said that France and Germany talks, let's say, quite often. For smaller countries, better only to talk when they have something really to say, yeah, they really can contribute. So there is some kind, if you want, of power difference. But as I said before, this is not absolute. There's a veto. And let's say, I'm quite often surprised how this at the end works and gets out. I wouldn't call it a miracle, but it's sometimes really strange. So far, I looked what the European Council did, what are the roles, constitutional article, master of enlargement, economic governance, justice and home affairs, common foreign and security policy. I looked a little bit how it worked internally. Let me finish with the two remarks of the crisis. The one was, especially from 2020, and still goes on if you in certain ways, that's the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, where the European Council in July 2020 really achieved a major decision to create this kind of new facility, recovery and resilience facility. And here, what I said before, there is a famous saying by Van Rompuy, who was the first permanent president of the European Council, or full-time president of the European Council, who said we had to take a decision, that was during the financial crisis, which was unavoidable in the moment and unthinkable half a year ago. Yeah? So again, in the pandemic, there were decisions, for example, that the Commission can get money from the international capital market. And so debt making for the Union, they found some kind of interesting legal way to get that through, apparently, but to borrow money, to give it to member states. This was really a taboo breaking. Also the increase of the budget, not anymore 1% of gross domestic product on 1.8%. So you could see that there were really taboo breaking decisions which will open, and we have to see in how far, also the way to what some would call the fiscal union. That's open, and as always, European Council does not take any decision about the finalité finale, if you want to say it. They are not taking decisions to say that should be at the end what we understand as European Union. They take limited but real decisions for progressing. So this was a major way to deal with the crisis. And here again, as I said, this was a supranational effect, Commission borrowing money, debt making for the European Union, and all the legal acts have to be implemented by the normal ordinary legislative procedure. So the European Parliament and the Council put what the European Council had in their conclusions into real concrete legal acts. Again, people forget that the European Parliament there played a major role and had to play a major role and did a major role. So again, as you see, I'm fighting this bias. The European Council is just intergovernment above our heads. The second crisis, I don't want to go too deep into it now because we might discuss it more, is of course a crisis around with the war of Ukraine. And I mentioned at the beginning already that the European Council met in an emergency meeting directly and decided a couple of major sanctions. I was asked once by another student, do you think that Putin was surprised about, let's say, the unity of the Union in many ways? Of course, in certain ways, there's, let's say, slight open questions, which are not fully, let's say, covered. But overall, this was an enormous step together, all 27, and then together also with the United States and Canada and others joining, like Switzerland. Very interesting, by the way, that the Swiss followed the sanctions concerning the banking system. So this was really something important. And as I said, one student asked me, do you think that Putin had imagined that? And I said, of course, I don't know what Putin thought and what his advisor were telling him. But I was surprised, Frank, that the European Council was able to achieve that as fast as it did it. And I think the European Council as council, and I would add all the meeting of the ministers, especially of the foreign ministers, the meetings with the responsible in the United States, and I think to a certain degree, so perhaps less visible with the United Kingdom. Of course, these meetings lead to some kind of common perception. They created, if you want, a common narrative about making clear that this is Putin's war and that the EU needs to take tough economic sanctions against it. I think this narrative was developed together. It's very important for the public opinion. So let's say that's, as I said, I was surprised that this worked as fast as and close as it was. Perhaps the most important impact, perhaps, of this was the speech of the German Chancellor last Sunday in the Bundestag, and changing, let's say, the basic German military or defense policy and foreign policy since at least German unification, going into the direction of increasing the subventions for the military side and being part of the economic sanctions. Though, let's say, for German industry, of course, there are also losses like others too. So it's not just the German. But I think, and that's interesting, but I cannot give you any nearer clue because I don't have the empirical evidence, how much the German Chancellor was influenced by his colleagues to tell him, to develop together this idea, this is too serious to be just working by national means. We have to have a common narrative, a common approach. And I think that's perhaps one way which we can look at how the European Council really dealt with this crisis. By the way, the European Council also always dealt with crisis for historical background, because I read quite a lot of my colleagues who say, there is now the Polish crisis, especially that's something different than from history. No, that's not different history. The European Council was created in the 70s when there were a couple of Polish crises, if you want. Some was a breakdown of the Bretton Woods system, the energy supply the increasing tension between East and West, the Warsaw Pact and NATO. So my point, Ramūnas, I don't see you anymore. I hope you're still there. An alle, the connection again is back on my side. Okay, so my point is, European Council for you or for us in our academic community is a key institution which needs to be analyzed and assessed carefully. As I said, we might have limits because we are not present. There is no way to participate in that and to make notes and to say how the members of the European Council acted together. So it's fascinating on one side, frustrating on the other side, but it means to understand the history of the EU, not later than the late 60s, and the history of Europe. You cannot avoid, or you should not avoid, to look closer at what the European Council did, in which kind of context they did what are the leaders of the generations of leaders in the European Council who really did move to consensus, even sometimes very complicated night-long sessions, etc., but achieved some kind of consensus which had a lasting impact on our European countries, on Europe in general. Okay, that would be so far my, let's say, introduction to the debate. Ramūnas, how are we going to proceed? Because he wanted to lead the debate. Ramūnas. Ramūnas. Yeah, if he doesn't, I just jump into it. Or is there anybody else who is qualified to run our debate? Anybody? Modestas, are you fit to lead the debate? That would be always nicer than if I would do it myself. Modestas, please go ahead.
Well, I'm not sure what the professor had planned for this lecture, but if the connection doesn't come back, so I believe then we have to, well, start to ask questions, I guess.
Yeah, exactly.
So, okay, so does any of my colleagues have any questions for the professor? Okay, Vincentas.
Yes, hello, Professor. Thank you for joining us for this lecture. And I have a question regarding the voting in the European Council. And as in the crisis, I think one of the most important things is time. But usually in the European Council, to reach a common decision, it usually takes a lot of time, couple of days. And for example, in Ukraine crisis, here in Lithuanian public opinion was that they're taking too long to reach a decision regarding, for example, cut off SWIFT banks, etc. And maybe one of the ways that the council could speed up the process is to vote by qualified majority voting in the common security and the common foreign policy area. So in your opinion, what should be the conditions that the council would move to such a point where they would vote on the qualified majority voting means? Thank you.
Yeah. Modesta, should I answer directly or should we collect?
Well, I believe if you can, then let's start answering questions. And if Professor Ramūnas comes back, so then he could take over.
Yeah, perhaps you write him a small chat, the chat room, that he sees that you are taking up the role as a moderator. Indeed, I mean, this is a basic issue which has been discussed at many times. Qualified majority voting. The rule in the treaty is, the general rule is consensus. That means veto power of each member. But there are exceptions with qualified majority voting. This concerns especially the election of certain positions. So proposing the president of the commission or voting for their own president, they can use qualified majority voting for that. So there are exceptions, but these are on the election functions of the European Council, not on substance. On the substance, indeed, there, I think we have a very basic and fundamental issue. First of all, we have to see what are really the competences of the European Union. I'm not always fit to say, for example, if SWIFT, the banking side, is really a competence which belongs to the European Union. I would have to check that. I guess it's more national competence at the end. But again, perhaps there are good lawyers around who would help us. As long as they are national competences, you need in any case consensus. I think that's in legal and sovereign ways of sovereignty the point. On other issues, I think I personally think the qualified majority voting in the council is very important that we have that. You will find, if you look at the statistics, how often this is being used in the council, when it could be used, where, let's say, there's a dossier in the ordinary legislative procedure where the council could vote by qualified majority, you will find that in 90%, or it varies a little bit over the time, the council takes the decision by consensus. So there is no voting, or sometimes some countries abstain. That they don't like it too much and they want to indicate back home, that's not our idea, but let's say we accept it and we abstain for the vote. And I think that's important. I mean, the point is, and this is a major, I think, factor for stability, that the basic issue is not to find qualified majority voting where, for example, some countries are always in a minority position. That's what the British were afraid of, that they were in many ways in minority positions. But that the idea is, especially the goal set on something, in vital issues for national interest, you try to find consensus. And I think that's very important. And to be frank with this SWIFT issue, if I look at my colleagues who looked at that carefully, this is, of course, a very crucial issue for Germany, and I think for Italy as far as I got, and for other countries too, because it really concerns basic functioning of trade with Russia, which has a major importance. I mean, the gas imports of Russia are very important still for Germany. So let's say I would be a little bit careful about majority voting because you might lose countries in that. And I'm not talking about Germany in this sense. I talk about many other countries who would say, no, we are not going so far, and that's not concerning our, it's not in our interest. So I would be careful about the speed to get to these sanctions. Yes, you could argue it could have been faster, but I think in diplomatic terms, the idea was to make the sanctions, to threaten with sanctions, but only to have the sanctions made or implemented if and as soon as Russia would take this kind of warlike, not warlike, but war steps, military attacks. I think that could be debated. If perhaps this, if it would have happened earlier, it might have had another impact on Russian positions. But I think we have difficulties to look at the counterfactual situation. It's always difficult to say, if we would have done this and this earlier, we would have this and this positive effect. So I think it's open to debate. As I said, personally, I'm surprised how far the European Union, steered by the European Council, but also by foreign ministers and ministers of interior, really went on this issue. I think, as again, the question was if Putin thought that there was such a unity. I don't know what he thought and what his experts thought. But let's say I'm surprised about what was able, and I think it's very important for the future of Europe, what just happened with all the terrible events and developments which we see at the same time. Ramūnas, we started. Modesta was he was taking the chair of moderating the meeting, but of course that's your job if you are back.
I still have connection problems which keep resurfacing. So if we could proceed with Greta's question and then Paulina afterwards.
Yeah. So who is first? Greta, yeah?
Yes, okay. So as you already mentioned, either the head of state or head of the government can attend the European Council meetings. And over the recent years, there was an established practice in Lithuania that the president goes to these meetings. Yet after the recent elections, there was a harsh debate whether it's a prime minister's or president's responsibility to attend these meetings. Based on Lithuanian constitution, the government is responsible for economic and social affairs, and the president is for foreign policy. So which one of these officials, in your opinion, is more suitable to attend the European Council meetings? Or maybe it should more depend on the issue that is being discussed?
Yeah, that's an issue which, of course, not only for your country, we had some others. The general atmosphere is clear. I always tell my students that the Queen of Denmark or the King of the Netherlands or the President of the Federal Republic of Germany are not participating, which is very obvious because they don't have any political responsibility in a narrower sense. Of course, in a general sense, they should represent their country, but it would be wrong that they would go to the European Council meeting. So in many countries, it's very simple. It's a prime minister, chancellor. In France, it's of course the president who has, according to the constitution of the Fifth Republic, a broader responsibility, and has since de Gaulle just taken that, and there is no debate. There was, if in France there is a cohabitation, that means that the prime minister is from another party than the party of the president. Then we had occasions where the president and the prime minister went to European Council meetings. Of course, that's not liked very much, and that's not, let's say, a very useful way. But I just want to indicate this problem is not just that of your country. Now, for me, it would be very difficult to make any, let's say, advice on that. I can only say, as I said before, the European Council deals with a state-like agenda. So they talk about each subject of national, or could talk about many subjects of national political policies, which might be sometimes more, also internal issues, domestic policies, sometimes international policies. So to be frank, I would not know what to give as an advice to the situation. And I understand that this is a problematic situation. I understand that. I think we had in Finland also for a certain time this kind of debate, because the Finnish president is also more political than the president of the Federal Republic of Germany, for example. So that's again and again coming up, but it's very difficult to make any advice who should really go there. I think important for the others is that the person who is there and agreeing to something, that this person should be able to implement it back at home. So let's say not to say, yes, we could do that, and flying back to the capital, and the capital says, no, perhaps we can't do it, or somebody else turns up, no, we don't want to do it. So important is that the members, if they agree, are able really to put that in national politics. That's, I think, crucial for the handling of European affairs by the European Council. For foreign ministers or ministers, they could sometimes say, we don't like it, we need to talk back to our capital. But prime ministers, chancellors can't do that. They need to say, okay, we do that, and I try everything that this will then become national policies. I'm sorry that I Peter, that I don't give you a clear answer, but it's interesting to see how the debate will go on. So who was traveling to Brussels last Thursday? The president.
The president.
Yeah. That's let's say what I saw that. Okay. Yeah. I'm sorry. This reflects that we have different constitutions in the 27 countries, and let's say the idea is that according to each constitution and how it's run, let's say a person should act in the European arena. That means including that of the European Council.
If I could just add, Wolfgang, we used to have a practice where both President and Prime Minister were attending EU Council summits, but it stopped with the Lisbon Treaty. I think no member state has two heads of state and government participating anymore since Lisbon Treaty came into force. I think, the question by Greta also brings up importance of coordination of European affairs within each country, because that becomes crucial, because our president is really mostly responsible for foreign affairs. But then, as you said, usually there are different issues discussed during EU Council meeting, and then on some of them it's government's responsibility to decisions when they are implemented, or in other words, it's a ruling majority's responsibility. So there is then a need for very, very strong coordination and mutual exchange of information, which is experiencing problems recently in Lithuania, I think. But according to our European coordination system, Ministry of Foreign Affairs is responsible within the government for coordinating. So in this sense, probably it's logical that president, who is also responsible for foreign affairs, is representing Lithuania at the EU Council meetings. Okay, Paulina, please go ahead.
As you've already mentioned, Europe is currently facing another major crisis, and that's Russia's war on Ukraine. And the EU does cooperate on security and defense matters, and the European Council plays a part in here too, in endorsing security and defense cooperation with NATO, and monitoring its progress. And this war pushed the EU to take security matters even more seriously. So recently, as you mentioned, we saw the EU agree not only on economic sanctions, but also on financing the Ukraine army and on providing lethal equipment. So my question is, what new developments do you think we are going to see in this area? And is the European Council going to will show leadership and set new priorities on the EU agenda, and try to deepen European integration in this way and deeper cooperation in security and defense?
I think, as always, looking into the future is very difficult because you don't know what happens tomorrow. For example, let's say something which is the unknown knowns, something which we have to see. We don't know the result. Are the French elections, presidential election. If, let's say, somebody who would be from the right wing, Marie Le Pen, would become French president, this might lead to different ways than if the president will remain and will perhaps even get out stronger than before. So these are some factors which we have to take into account without knowing what they will do. My point when I said I was surprised about what was achieved, I think it reflects documents what I think, as far as I look at media, all over the Union, or I might even call it the West, is developing, that this was really a shock. This was really a shock, and in some way a symmetric shock. That means all were concerned somehow. So we know, of course, that the Eastern members of the European Union neighboring Ukraine, or partly even also Russia, for Kaliningrad, for example, that they are more concerned than perhaps Portugal or Ireland is. But my impression that also those countries who are geographically further away from Ukraine have felt and see that there is something which has changed the political landscape. Some say of let's say what was developed after the Second World War, and it's especially of what you might see after the end of the Soviet Union, early 90s of last century. So I think there is a shock, there is a change, and I think it's very difficult to see exactly in which direction this shock will be dealt with, or which will be digested, if I take this term. There might be more in than for a long time it was thought in defense area. And if you look at the Treaty of Lisbon, you will see that there is a paragraph in the area, in the chapter on common foreign and security policies, which says that the European Union can also frame a common defense policy leading to common defense insofar as the European Council acts unanimously on that and gets national ratification. So let's say the treaty enables a certain policy. I would not expect that this article will be really used. We have also the article, which I think is very interesting. It's the Article 42, paragraph 7, which is similar to the Article 5 of the NATO Washington Treaty, which says that one member of the EU, if one member of the EU attacked, the others have to help this country with all their means. Then there are two exceptions to that in the next sentence. One is an exception for the neutrals, and one is an exception for NATO countries. So let's say all could somehow say, yes, we should help the attacked country, but we also look at this and this paragraph. What I want to say, the Lisbon Treaty has a lot of, let's say, opportunities, enabling clauses, which sometimes are forgotten, but in these kind of cases might be used and should be used. So I'm still a little bit, let's say, wondering myself, and need a lot of debates with others, also politicians, how this can be changed. I mentioned already the German change in military policies, which if they take place as, let's say, promised by the Chancellor, that's enormous change. I talked to one of my Dutch colleagues who said the Netherlands were, as the Germans, not taking defense seriously for a long time. So they were not always best in their, especially in their normal troops. And also those countries certainly have at least seen the shock, how far they are ready to change basically, fundamentally, their defense policies. It's open to debate, but let's say we would see certainly new moves in the next time. And I mentioned already, I think one arena will be after the French election, assuming that Macron will stay. And also, of course, what we don't know at all, at least I don't know it, what will happen with the Ukraine and what will be really the Russian policies, which are full of questions mark, apparently, for everybody who takes responsibility in Europe and in the West. So there are still a lot of open questions which will impact on the efforts to do more together in defense in a broader sense. And for example, energy supply is part of this broader defense, I think, which we see. So we could speculate and should perhaps speculate about it, not against speculation also as academics, but we should indicate that this is educated guesses, that we don't know the future. That's quite clear. And but we can debate what might be opportunities. And as I said, I think it would be I would like to add something, like with the July 2020, I turned the resilience or recovery and resilience facility was decided by European Council, opening quite a lot of issues on new own resources, on possible steps towards fiscal union. These decisions of European Council can open the way to more defense communities. There are some, as we know, already going on, but these are all, I would say, rather, let's say, of a limited importance. I don't know, Paulina, would that give an answer to your question?
Absolutely, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Other questions? Well, if you are still thinking, Wolfgang, I would also like to ask you for another educated guess, unless you were already asked about that when I was disconnected. Next week, European Council is meeting again. Do you think any decisions will be made regarding the perspective of EU membership, promising candidate status to Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova?
I think that's, for me, very open. I guess there might be some who would support this idea. I think the majority would be very hesitant about it. And I guess that the question we dealt with that, I think personally, I would not recommend to offer membership, because membership is a very serious affair, not only for the countries entering the union, but for the union overall. So I think this needs to be done in a very reflected way. And I don't think, to be frank, that membership of any of these countries helps them against the Russian threat. And I would even imagine that the Russian feel more provoked, not as much as if they would join NATO, but also the European Union is seen not as a friendly neighbor, but let's say as something to spread the European values, and that means against some of the Russian interests. So I think in strategic terms, I wouldn't recommend that. And for the EU as really being able to act together, I think it would be even a mistake in the moment. I would claim that, because then, of course, other countries like North Macedonia and others will come in, and let's say the whole debate will start, who should be member or not. And I think what is needed is to do more directly of help for Ukraine or citizens from the Ukraine who have to flee from their country. So I would, I'm not favoring that, as you see, offer for membership.
But I mean, there is no serious debate about giving membership. Even European Parliament this week did not suggest that in its resolution. It was talking about giving the status of candidate country. So what do you think about this? Because that's a symbolic, sort of symbolic decision to inspire Ukrainians, but you know, it does not eliminate all the standard process of going through chapter by chapter with negotiations, assessment of the candidate country, and so on.
Yeah, but especially, as you said, it's at the first step a little bit more symbolic. And we have, of course, one country with even has membership negotiations since 2005. That's Turkey.
Yes, Turkey.
And that's, of course, not a good example, if you want to say so. So even to give a candidate status, I don't know what this will really offer. It's not certainly reducing the pressures of Russia. They would see that as something they don't like, if I'm being very careful to formulate. And secondly, this is nothing which helps Ukraine in the moment on the ground, or the citizens of Ukraine in the EU countries. And I think we have to be serious also about the future of this European Union. Let's say, I'm sometimes worried, if you look at some of the member countries of the European Union, is this really reinforcing the European Union? How can we deal with that in serious situations, etc.? So we must be careful of not overdoing this symbolic act. So I would be very careful. but I don't know what, I think my position is shared by many, and I don't know if late at night, perhaps the European Council says, yeah, as you said, it's a gift without that we have to pay too much in the moment. But I think it's a poisoned gift, to be frank.
Thank you. Do we have more questions? Wolfgang, then I would still raise you another one related to German position within the EU. What's your assessment of how the current situation, how can it affect German energy policy? Because there is a widespread perception in Lithuania that mostly because of those extensive links of trade in natural gas and oil, which Germany has even expanded since annexation of Crimea with Russia, which is constraining EU's decision-making on sanctions. I mean, we see that energy trade in natural gas and other resources with Russia is basically exempt from EU's sanctions. Gazprom Bank, which deals with payments and so on, is not included into the package. So is there now a serious reflection in Germany about reducing this dependency and maybe about going back to using nuclear power? I know that Greens party is strongly against it, but what's your take on the ongoing discussion now?
Yeah, again, as I said, the shock was also on this issue. So let's say the Greens and others, it's not just the Greens, are saying if we have enough solar energy and wind energy, we don't need gas. But of course, there's not always much wind in Germany, and certainly not always much sun. Let's say the aims to get really renewable energy only are long-term aspect, and we need, and that's a general attitude, some kind of energy sources in between before we get there, if we get there at all. That's another issue. And for getting there, gas, and that means also 50% of the gas is coming from Russia. The gas from Russia plays an important role to lead the German economy away from coal and away from nuclear energy to, let's say, this renewable energy. This is, let's say, the general line of thinking. Of course, that is now put to question very much. The Green says this is also a very good reason to increase even more the building up of wind and solar energy. So it's also in strategic terms important, not only in climate terms important, but also in strategic terms. But that will be not enough for the next years, even though if you invest more. And then the idea is to get some kind of gas from the United States, for which there will be new ports being built. Also there is not too much, let's say, hope. Then what the Green minister, this poor guy, because he wants, of course, he is Minister for Economy and Climate. He is the leader of the Green Deal, if you want, has now to look, and he is even confronted with, oh yeah, can we prolong the electricity by coal, which is the worst thing, or by nuclear? There are still some nuclear electricity factories existing. So that's really on the agenda, and I don't know how this will be really put into effect. But I said the shock led to reopen quite a lot of issues, not perhaps to change it basically, but as I said, some would say with renewables, we are out of this kind of blackmail by the Russian side. But this takes time. So let's say there are a lot of open questions now, and I wonder how they get along to find a way there.
Another question, if I may.
Yeah.
since we still have a bit of time. How do you see the dynamic within the European Council after British left the EU? Because there were forecasts that position of France would become stronger. French voice would become even louder, and for Germany it might be more difficult to act as a sort of mediator between France and the UK as it used to. So do you see as this French-German tandem getting stronger as a result of this? But then again, some counter examples would be last year's June Council meeting when Chancellor Merkel came up with the idea to reinforce relations with Russia, and I'm sure you know this sort of mini crisis in the run-up to the Council meeting when a German-French initiative was resisted by most small member states, and they succeeded in eliminating the proposal to have highest level meetings with Russia, between the EU and Russia. So yeah, how do you see dynamic after Brexit within the EU? Because small countries, Nordic countries, were concerned that this, British were providing important counterbalance in this respect, especially when we think about transatlantic relations, about free trade agreements and so on. So what's your assessment?
And let's say, when I talk about surprises, one of the surprises for me in the last years with the whole Brexit negotiation and others was how, let's say, of limited relevance this was seen by many countries. I mean, I remember Swedish European ministers during the negotiation who said, yeah, they want out, and means out. Let's say, there was an astonishing unity in the Union and in the European Council to not open any special relationship with the United Kingdom and make, let's say, to reduce the coherence within the EU. So let's say that was for me also to a certain degree surprising, because of course there are certain countries, the Netherlands and Sweden and Denmark, to a certain degree also Germany had special relations, if you want, with the United Kingdom. But again, I guess that the United Kingdom, the British government made mistakes thinking that they could really divide the EU side, and that was not possible. Apparently, that was clear. So in this sense, in the European Council, like in many issues, the British were, of course, let's say, saying, oh, go ahead, we opt out. Yeah? That's for the Euro, for the Schengen area, and for others, that the British said, yeah, we are interested in the internal market, and very short on that, and perhaps here and there common positions in foreign policy, but as far as we agree to that. But we are not interested in Euro, we are not interested in the, so much at least in the area of freedom, security, and justice, etc. So let's say the British, I wouldn't say they were always a brake. Let's say they were not a driver. And let's say I think most other countries realize that if they want to achieve something, the British would not be of help. They had their own way and their own interests, and sometimes they were very helpful, and it was good to have them, I'd say, but it was not really pushing ahead. What I also see, because you know that quite a lot of our colleagues, and I had a very good PhD student on that a couple of years ago, Funda Tekin, are talking about differentiation. My argument is now we have much less, we will see much less, let's say, differentiation within the EU, because we don't have the United Kingdom anymore. The United Kingdom, as I said, could say, go ahead, it might look interesting, but we don't want to share that, and we have opt out. And then others could follow, like Denmark or Sweden in the Euro, and etc. This will be less and less. And there is even the speculation that in July 2020, the big budget issues with the United Kingdom, this would not have taken place in the EU budget, but in the Euro budget. So let's say not all member states would have been really involved because the United Kingdom would not have shared this point of view. Of course, that's speculation, but I think it indicates a little bit that the United Kingdom was, for some countries, as you rightly said, especially in budget terms, very helpful. It was good also for the Germans for concerned trade policy, open trade policy, etc. So they were helpful here and there, but not really a major player in many crucial issues. And you know, also in the military side, we have, since the Brexit referendum, there are these special forms of military cooperation, which are called PESCO, which are perhaps of limited relevance at the end, so far as I see. But they could clearly see the British would have stopped that, would have vetoed that. Now that they're moving out, they said, okay, go ahead. And let's say 25 member countries tried to do so, to use that in some way or other. So I think the dynamics are more, let's say, more positive at the end, if you think integration is positive. And that's, of course, a human assumption. Yeah, I think, of course, in certain ways, Southern European countries who want more money getting a little bit stronger because the United Kingdom has Northern, let's say, with fiscal discipline is no more in. But to be frank, I had the impression that this really is not of a major importance. I mean, I studied really carefully the whole Recovery and Resilience Facility in July 2020 to the July meeting and from the July meeting. Yeah, the frugal countries could play their role. Perhaps they were a little bit hampered because the United Kingdom was no more there. But to be frank, the Dutch Prime Minister didn't care. He is, let's say, self-confident enough to say no, and so were others too. So yes, for some, in some positions, it might have been helpful for some member countries to have the UK in, but overall, I think they didn't miss the United Kingdom for moving the Union ahead. The other issue, of course, is much broader. Is it good that the United Kingdom is outside the whole Union in economic and political terms? I think that's harmful for us, but this is outside our kind of influence. That was the British decision, and now they are out. And let's say I didn't see too much negative impact of them moving out from the dynamics of the European Council.
Okay, thank you very much. We have a couple more questions and 9 minutes left, so let's proceed, Vincente.
Yes, I have a question regarding the internal relationships between the Council and the Commission. As the Council represents the more intergovernmental method, and during the crisis, as we see Euro crisis, they established ECM mechanism rather outside of the whole EU treaties mechanism. So in the future, what will be the dynamics? Are the Council would be supportive of a new integration plans proposed by a Commission, or this tension left since the Euro crisis will still linger to the future next? Thank you.
Yeah, I think what you take up is a conventional wisdom, I would call it. And I would really have another alternative reading of that. You are right for the financial crisis, or the sovereign debt crisis, that there were two instruments or two treaties, the fiscal compact and the European Stability Mechanism, were in treaties outside the Union. Though the Commission was mentioned there, so given certain points. At the same time, the financial crisis led to or opened the way to the banking union, to a capital market union, where the Commission plays a certain role, perhaps in the banking union more the European Central Bank, but another supranational body. So again, I would say, yes, there were some moves which might be characterized as intergovernmental, but others who really reinforced the supranational side. In the crisis, in the pandemic crisis, I have a clear position. the Commission profited enormously because they have to look at the proposals of the member states for getting money out of this facility. The criteria are set by regulation, and they can say yes or no to it. And they have to administer it. So I think the Commission became really reinforced on that issue, and was also very important for, let's say, drafting the final regulation or the conclusions of the European Council session. Of course, as I said before, you never know exactly how and who were crucial for finding consensus. That's, let's say, for outsiders difficult, and sometimes that's for insiders who was influenced by whom and who could influence whom. But I think the Commission President, he was very active, and let's say, taking up a Franco-German proposal. She was, let's say, putting things down on paper, which then, with some changes, of course, were accepted by the European Council. And as I said, for implementing this facility, the Commission got additional powers, as I would see it. So I think this relationship is not simple to say. If you take, I don't know if you have this, the principal agent approach in social science, that the European Council is just the principal and the Commission is just implementing what the principal tells to this institution. I think it's much more complex. The Commission is very active in planning the conclusions. They are part of drafting the conclusions and trying to look what is good for them, if I may say so. And here, therefore, I think the Commission is also profiting from being part of the European Council, and some decisions of the European Council really reinforce their position. In the conclusions, I recommend you to look at that. The European Council has this nice formulation. The European Council invites the Commission to do that and that. I like this formula, invite. So it gives a certain kind of order. But let's say, as far as I get it, this invitation is formulated by the Commission itself. They want to get a mandate from the European Council to go to the Council of Ministers, and tell the ministers, look here, your bosses have made following conclusion, and now we translate that into legal acts. So that's, I think, I would be careful of not just following this conventional wisdom, which is there, the Commission is losing to the Intergovernmental European Council. I would not share this point of view.
Thank you, Modeste. Do you still have a question? There are a few minutes for the last question.
Well, the professor very much answered it because it was quite similar to Vincenta's question. My question was more on the tension between the European Council and the European Commission, because as you probably all remember, last year there was this scandal that the media dubbed Sofagate, where the Commission President was denied the chair at the reception by Turkey's President Erdogan. There was also talk that this competition is way past a personal one, but more represents a competition between the institutions. I believe there was also talk during the beginning of the term of this commission of a geopolitical commission, but now when we need one, when we really need the geopolitical commission, the European Council is the institution that is leading the way in regards to these questions. So, Professor, you very much answered the question on the relationship between these institutions, but if you have anything else to add, so please.
I like this picture with the sofa gate. I use that all for my teaching, to be frank, because it indicates what I said before. There, the external action of the European Union, that's the term of the treaty, it's based on two pillars: the economic, which is represented by the President of the Commission, and the Common Foreign Security by the President of the European Council. Which is a weakness, of course, for the European Union. If you have two persons talking to the President of the United States or to the President of Turkey in this sense. So for me, this is a very good way to demonstrate with this picture the situation. Of course, I know that the people in Ankara were furious. Also, the EU delegation was furious, but I don't know who was really at the end to blame. Of course, persons and politicians, I said also the president of the Commission and the president of the European Council are tough politicians. I mean, they are, let's say, so they look for their own profile, their own power. But as far as we see it, I get the impression that these are not basic fundamental cleavages between the two of them. That's at least what you see from the outside. And I guess in those crises, which you just see, we quite often see that both are talking to the media together, or let's say both are there and talk to the media about their position. So I would not see there as a basic issue. My more fundamental issue is the relation between European Council and European Parliament. But for that, we would need another, let's say, 10 minutes to go more in detail into that. But that's, I think, a much more fundamental issue. And that needs more considerations, how to deal with that in a proper way.
Okay, well, we reached the time limit of our discussion. I think the last issue was very good to conclude with because overall it was very much about interinstitutional relations. And thank you very much, Wolfgang, for going through, for stressing the importance of particular policy areas. We should always be quite specific which policy areas we are discussing when we are discussing roles of those EU institutions. That's very much also the logic of this course, which I am teaching, and we will go through different stages of policy making process, and then we will go through different types of public policies and see how those institutions interact, and we'll conclude with the Conference of Europe ideas about the reforms of polity. It's good that you use this term polity, because I also introduced students to this distinction between politics, policies, and polity. So unless you have just a few thoughts about what you expect from the Conference of Europe, or you think it's up to the presidential elections in France that will be decisive factor?
If I may, just a footnote. First of all, I think the whole procedure for the Conference for the Future of Europe is very opaque. I mean, who takes, they need to have consensus between the bodies, etc. So I think it's on purpose not a way to really create some kind of public support, etc. But we will see. So that's, let's say I'm interested how they deal now with the situation of the crisis, of the Ukraine crisis. How they take that up. I mean, we talked about that. Will they do something about European defense? I mean, we talked about possibilities. So that would be for me. And also, by the way, it's not only the Conference of Future, but also the so-called strategic compass, which the High Representative is supposed to submit now to the European Council. And I just wonder how this looks. It might look very, let's say, ridiculous even. I mean, to talk about 5,000 people somewhere to get together doesn't answer the challenges which we see in the moment. So in both papers, I think we try to find how far the shock, which we all have, will be taken up or not. And I think that's a major issue for us in the future, how we can deal. And I would include, as I said, also the positions of the Recovery and Resilience Facility to lead to some kind of more fiscal union, and this one to more defense union, and how these are really coordinated and made compatible. I think that's a very interesting and stimulating issue we are now facing, besides, of course, being very worried about the political and military situation in Ukraine.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'm really grateful for your time, Wolfgang, for your insights, comments. Thanks to students for taking active part in the discussion. And well, I hope this is not the last time we have you in our institute's discussions, and we will continue this this tradition. I think it's correct now to speak about tradition already.
Yeah, yeah.